January 12, 1941. A bitter wind scraped across the RAF airfield at Northolt, carrying the metallic smell of fuel and the lingering dust of last night's raid. Ground crews hurried around the battered Hawker Hurricanes, patching bullet holes, tightening bolts, and cursing the cold. These aircraft had been the backbone of the Battle of Britain, rugged, reliable, deadly in the hands of the right pilot. But they also had a problem, one that every mechanic knew too well. The wings were taking hits they simply shouldn't have survived. Not because the German bullets were too strong, but because the Hurricanes kept getting hit in the first place. They simply weren't as good at avoiding enemy fire as the Spitfires. They were tougher, yes, but they weren't as nimble, not as slippery in the sky. And that wasn't just about engine power or turning radius. It came down to something far smaller. Something so tiny and so ridiculous that pilots laughed when they first heard about it. It was a strip of tape, not armor, not plating, not a secret new metal or classified system, just tape, woven fabric tape with adhesive, the kind ground crews normally use to seal fabric control surfaces. And it wasn't even placed where you'd expect, like over vulnerable fuel lines or ammunition compartments. No, this tape went somewhere stranger, along the wings, running in smooth, straight lines from the leading edge toward the fuselage, almost like the stripes on a race car. The man responsible? A quiet, unassuming aeronautical engineer named Frederick Lindemann, though most people on base simply called him the Prof. He was not a frontline pilot. He wasn't even officially part of Hurricane design. He was an advisor to Churchill on scientific matters. And yet, through a combination of observation, physics, and stubbornness, he uncovered a flaw in the Hurricane's aerodynamics that almost nobody else had noticed. When he proposed his fix, a long strip of fabric tape meant to modify airflow, pilots laughed. Commanders rolled their eyes. Test squadrons questioned whether he was playing some kind of joke. But within weeks, this ridiculous add-on would quietly begin changing the fate of Hurricanes in combat. Because as absurd as it sounded, that tape helped pilots dodge bullets they never even saw coming. To understand why, you have to imagine sitting inside a Hurricane cockpit at 15,000 feet. You're in formation, engine vibrating the frame, wind hammering the canopy. Your instruments tremble. Your gloves are stiff with cold. And then out of nowhere, a Messerschmitt Bf-109 dives on you from above. He has the sun at his back, he's closing fast, and you have only seconds to react. Every pilot in those early months of the war reported the same thing. When you pulled hard into a brake turn to evade, the Hurricane responded, just not fast enough. It hesitated, shuddered, and lost energy too early. Not dramatically, not obviously, but just enough that the German pilot stayed locked onto you for 1, sometimes 2 extra seconds. And in aerial combat, 2 seconds is a lifetime. 2 seconds means a burst of 20mm cannon fire. 2 seconds means the difference between living and tumbling into the channel. The engineers had explanations ready. The Hurricane had thicker wings than the Spitfire. It had a fabric-covered rear fuselage. It wasn't meant to be a pure dogfighter. All true. But Lindemann didn't buy that this was the whole story. He suspected something stranger was happening, something hidden in the airflow itself. During one inspection, he ran his hand along the Hurricane's wing leading edge and noticed something subtle, almost too subtle to matter. The airflow wasn't reattaching cleanly. The wing was experiencing early boundary layer separation. In plain English, the wing wasn't slicing the air as cleanly as the blueprint suggested. The flow was turbulent in ways that textbooks didn't predict. And when a pilot yanked the control stick for a sharp turn, that misbehavior in the air became lethal hesitation. Lindemann believed there was a way to trip the airflow intentionally, creating turbulence earlier, in a controlled, predictable way, so the wing behaved more consistently at high angles of attack. It was the same principle behind vortex generators decades later, except cruder, simpler, almost embarrassingly simple. That's where the tape came in. He instructed ground crews to lay down a strip of fabric tape along the wing, precisely measured and positioned to force a specific kind of microturbulence. It sounded insane. Creating turbulence on purpose? Engineers spent their careers trying to reduce turbulence, not encourage it. But wind tunnel tests showed something extraordinary. With the tape applied, the Hurricane responded to sudden turns more cleanly. it lost less energy, it stalled later, and most importantly, it reacted faster when the pilot yanked the stick. That tiny bit of extra responsiveness meant German gunners suddenly found their targets slipping away just as they pulled the trigger. At first, pilots had no idea why their Hurricanes felt different. In fact, the earliest test groups weren't even told about the tape. They simply flew aircraft that had undergone minor aerodynamic adjustments. After landing, they climbed out of the cockpit, puzzled, saying things like, "She feels tighter today," or, "I don't know what you did, but that turn felt right." When Lindemann finally revealed the modification, many laughed in disbelief. A single strip of tape? That was it? That was the miracle solution? But laughter gave way to stunned respect as combat reports filtered in. Hurricanes with the tape modification were surviving ambushes at a noticeably higher rate. Gun camera footage showed bursts from German fighters snapping through empty sky where a Hurricane had just been. Pilots described feeling their aircraft bite into turns more reliably. The effect wasn't magical. It didn't turn Hurricanes into Spitfires. It didn't make pilots invincible. But it shaved off the deadly hesitation that had cost so many lives. It helped them dodge bullets by reacting a fraction of a second sooner, angling their aircraft just enough that cannon shells passed harmlessly by. This wasn't folklore. It wasn't wartime exaggeration. It became an officially recommended modification across numerous Hurricane squadrons. And while paperwork rarely highlighted it, after all, who wants to credit tape for saving aircraft? Combat performance made the truth obvious. The ridiculous wing tape worked. And it wasn't just Hurricanes. Lindemann's airflow insights later influenced modifications on Spitfires, Typhoons, and even early jet aircraft. Long before vortex generators and boundary layer control became standard aerodynamic tools, Britain had already stumbled onto the principle, thanks to an engineer who trusted physics over pride. Yet despite its impact, this story rarely appears in documentaries or war histories. It's overshadowed by the glamour of Spitfires, the drama of dogfights, and the heroism of pilots. Few people realize that during the tensest months of 1941, a strip of tape became an unsung piece of life-saving equipment. And the truth is, the tape didn't just change the Hurricane. It changed the pilots. When they realized their aircraft could respond faster, when evasive turns felt sharper and more reliable, their confidence grew. And confidence in the cockpit, especially for young pilots facing veteran Luftwaffe aces, could be the difference between bold action and fatal hesitation. One pilot, Flight Sergeant Robert Dixie Thompson, later described it simply, "The Hurricane felt like she woke up. I'd pull the stick and she'd come with me. Before the tape, I was always a heartbeat behind the German. After it, sometimes he was the one behind me." It wasn't a miracle. It was engineering, quiet, meticulous engineering that changed the course of air combat in ways almost invisible to the naked eye. But the story doesn't end with improved turns and dodged bullets. Because once the modification was fully adopted, British analysts noticed something else. Something unexpected. Something no one predicted. Hurricanes with wing trip tape weren't just evading enemy fire more successfully, they were landing more safely too. And that discovery opened a new chapter in understanding how a small tweak in airflow could influence every stage of flight, from takeoff to combat to the moment wheels met Earth again. Pilots returning from sorties began reporting smoother flare-outs during landing. The Hurricane, notorious for dropping a wing if the pilot misjudged speed, now behaved more predictably as it settled onto the runway. Ground crews chalked it up to pilot experience, but test results told a different story. The tape wasn't just enhancing performance in combat turns, it was stabilizing airflow across the entire wing, reducing sudden stalls in low-speed, high-stress moments. It was a strange, almost poetic twist. The same modification helping pilots dodge lethal cannon fire at altitude was also making their homecoming a little safer. And for the engineers, that revelation confirmed what Lindemann had believed from the start. Tiny aerodynamic truths mattered, not just in battle, but in every breath an aircraft took. But to fully understand how this fragile strip of fabric tape became part of aviation history, you have to look at the broader context. The Hurricane was one of the most effective fighters of early World War II, but compared to the sleek, elliptical-winged Spitfire, it was often dismissed as second best. Pilots ribbed each other about flying the wooden wonder, even though only part of the Hurricane was actually wood. Its design philosophy dated back to the 1930s, a transitional era between biplanes and fully modern monoplanes. That heritage had benefits and drawbacks. Hurricanes were tough. They could take punishment that would tear a Spitfire apart. But their aerodynamics weren't as refined. At high angles of attack, the airflow behaved like a stubborn mule. The wings were thick, rugged, and honest. No nonsense, no tricks. And that honesty betrayed them in a fight against German machines that optimized every curve, every rivet, every millimeter of surface to stay slippery in the sky. Lindemann saw what others overlooked. He recognized that the boundary layer, the thin layer of air hugging the wing, was the real battlefield. Even slight misbehavior in that invisible sheet of flowing air could put a pilot's life in danger. And he wasn't the first to study the phenomenon, but he was the first to tailor a practical fix for a frontline fighter during wartime. The tape was placed at a precise angle, positioned to create what aeronautical engineers call a turbulator. It forced the airflow to transition from smooth laminar flow into turbulent flow earlier than it naturally would. And turbulent flow, counterintuitive as it sounds, clings to a surface better. It resists separation at high angles. It gives the wing more lift in the moments when lift matters most. That meant the Hurricane could go just a little bit steeper, a little bit sharper before it stalled. And that tiny margin, measured in degrees and split seconds, was often enough to turn a deadly ambush into a narrow escape. But nothing in wartime is simple. The tape wasn't universally embraced immediately. Some squadrons complained that the tape peeled off in rainstorms. Others found that, if applied imprecisely, it could create new problems: buffeting, unexpected vibrations, even slight drag increases. Lindemann responded to every criticism with relentless testing. He pushed squadrons to standardize placement, standardize materials, standardize procedures, and slowly the resistance faded as results kept proving him right. By mid-1941, the modification had become common across Hurricane-equipped squadrons, sometimes officially, sometimes unofficially. Ground crews took pride in the ritual: measure, cut, stretch, press, like applying war paint to a machine that had already survived more battles than many of the men who flew it. Pilot logs began including curious entries like "tape applied today," "noticeable responsiveness," and "turns feel less mushy." One squadron leader wrote, "Enemy fire again passed behind me. I have never thanked tape before, but today I shall." The Luftwaffe, of course, had no idea. All they knew was that the Hurricanes they once chewed through with ease were suddenly more evasive, more elusive, more determined to survive. And while the Spitfire became the darling of propaganda and public imagination, it was the Hurricane, patched, taped, battered, that carried much of the early war on its broad shoulders. To the RAF, these simple modifications bought time. Time for new aircraft to arrive, time for tactics to evolve, time for pilots to gain the experience they desperately needed. And time, more than anything, was Britain's most precious resource in those desperate years. But there's an even deeper legacy to this story, one that reaches far beyond the Hurricane. Because Lindemann's tape wasn't just a battlefield fix, it pointed toward a future of aerodynamics still being written. It was an early, intuitive version of airflow control technology that would become essential in later decades. By the 1950s, jet aircraft engineers introduced metal vortex generators, tiny fin-like protrusions along the wings of planes like the English Electric Lightning and the Boeing 707. These weren't accidental innovations. They were the direct descendants of ideas sparked by wartime improvisation. They created controlled turbulence to keep airflow attached over critical surfaces, especially during steep climbs, hard turns, or low-speed maneuvers. What started as tape became metal. What started as guesswork became science. What started in the desperate winter of 1941 became standard practice across the world. There's something profoundly human in that progression. When under pressure, soldiers and engineers reach for whatever tools they have: string, tape, grease, wire, and through trial and error, they discover truths about the universe that textbooks haven't caught up with. War is tragedy, but it often accelerates understanding. It shows how small insights can save enormous numbers of lives. and in this case, a strip of tape became that insight. One of the most remarkable aspects of the story is how ordinary it seemed to those who lived it. In later interviews, some mechanics laughed and said they thought the tape experiment was just another boffin's scheme. Pilots shrugged, claiming they felt differences but couldn't always articulate them. Maybe the old girl was just in a good mood, one joked. But the numbers didn't lie. Attrition rates in certain Hurricane squadrons dropped noticeably after the modification. Evasive turn success increased. Enemy gun camera footage recovered after the war confirmed patterns. Hurricanes with the tape mod were harder to maintain a bead on during initial firing passes. They jinked faster, bled speed more predictably, and slipped out of danger more reliably. One German pilot's diary entry captured the experience from the other side. Translated after the war, it reads, "The old British fighter is becoming more troublesome. They turn more sharply now. The shot window is closing too fast." He didn't know it, but he was describing Lindemann's legacy. In an age of radar-guided shells, advanced gun sights, and high-performance engines, it's easy to forget how much of flight still depends on invisible forces we take for granted. Airflow, pressure, vortices, thin layers of moving molecules, they decide whether a pilot climbs or falls, lives or dies. And the people who understand those forces, who learn to shape them, can wield enormous influence with the smallest of tools. Lindemann himself would go on to advise Churchill throughout the war, influencing everything from bombing strategy to resource allocation. But among pilots, his quiet contribution to the Hurricane earned him a level of respect he rarely sought. Some called him eccentric, some called him brilliant, but most simply called him a man who helped save lives. And that's the heart of this story. Not that tape was a miracle, but that insight was. It shows how human ingenuity thrives under pressure, how even in a world dominated by giant factories, roaring engines, and lethal machinery, the smallest idea can ripple outward and change the outcome of battles. It reminds us that war is not just fought with bullets and aircraft, it's fought with minds, with observation, with curiosity, and with the courage to challenge assumptions, even when everyone else laughs. And so, in the frozen early months of 1941, on airfields where Hurricanes sat with their engines ticking in the cold, a simple strip of fabric tape became a symbol of that ingenuity. A reminder that sometimes the line between survival and destruction is measured not in armor or firepower, but in a single, subtle, invisible thread of airflow. Today, if you visit aviation museums and look closely at preserved Hurricanes, you may not see the tape, but you can often spot the faint lines where it once was. Tiny scars along the wings, silent reminders of the nights when mechanics crouched under dim lights to press them into place. Those lines tell a story only the engineers and the pilots truly understood. A story of a plane that refused to be outdated. A story of a modification so small most people would miss it. A story of bullets dodged not by luck, but by physics. And above all, a story of how one engineer's ridiculous idea helped an entire generation of pilots fly home when they otherwise might not have.